September was quite the roller coaster ride when it came to my reading. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Jess, and as you can tell, I'm coming at you with a September wrap-up. I read quite a few books this month, so I'm just gonna jump right into it. The first book that I finished was Bowl of Heaven by Gregory Benford and Larry Niven. I gave this book 2 stars, and I think it was a miracle that I even finished it to begin with. This is an adult sci-fi novel where a crew has been sent on an expedition to another star system. In the middle of their journey, they start running into issues, however. Their ship isn't moving as fast as it should, which means they're going to be running out of supplies soon. But on top of that, they find this massive bowl-like structure that's harnessing the power of a star and seems to be heading for the same star system that they're going for. As humans do, they decide to invade, and they end up getting captured by the mysterious inhabitants of this structure. It was messy, it was confusing, it was just plain boring to me. And it got so irritating for me at times because there were so many inconsistencies in this book. Now, I don't usually care about the science behind the books that I read for fun. I try not to think too hard about it. It has no effect on the plot for me. So imagine how glaring a mistake has to be for me to notice it right away. It's especially prevalent in the beginning. Some of the numbers that they're throwing out just don't add up. And that's not even getting into the writing inconsistencies. You've got characters being cleaned up and bandaged for the same wound twice. You've got characters pointing out something on one page and then completely forgetting about the thing on the next page. It was a mess. The worst example is that our main character, Cliff, is suddenly called Carl for a whole page before going back to Cliff. The dialogue was weird, the characterization was non-existent. I just felt like these characters lacked emotion and they lacked real drive. Once they got on the bowl, the majority of this book is them just wandering around. Nothing happened. Which I guess is why the ending felt like it had no resolution, because how can you tie up loose strings if there were no strings to begin with? Even so, the ending was super abrupt. In theory, the premise and the implication of the things they find out on the bowl are interesting, but the execution was just awful. I could not be less interested in picking up the sequel for this book. To be fair, adult sci-fi is one of those genres that I have a harder time really enjoying, but I don't think this book helps me out in any way. The next book that I read was I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy. Now, I gave this book 3 stars, but I do want to give a bit of a disclaimer. I listened to the audiobook and that might have had an impact on how much I enjoyed the story. I just struggle a bit more with auditory comprehension, so I find that I enjoy a story less than if I were physically reading it, but I do try to keep that in mind and account for that when I'm making a review of a book. If you've never heard of this book before, it's a YA contemporary following the twins Noah and Jude. Noah's perspective takes place while the twins are 13, while Jude's perspective takes place while they're 16. In Jude's perspective, you find out that the twins had a falling out and for some reason haven't spoken for 3 years. Overall, I did like this book. I thought it told a lovely story about second chances and accountability, and most of all, forgiveness for yourself and for others. I really appreciated that while there is romance in both perspectives, it's not overwhelming. The main focus of this book is family relationships, especially the broken one between Jude and Noah. I love how distinct both characters were. The alternating perspectives were very clear because each character had their own unique way of narrating and describing things, and they also had their own lives outside of each other. At 13, Noah lives and breathes for his art, and he's just starting to discover and explore his LGBT sexuality. In Jude's perspective, she's trying to feel confident in her own art and trying to come to terms with the guilt that she feels following the death of her mother. The thread that ties these two perspectives together is the very complex emotions that they feel for each other. Obviously, they love each other, but as you go through the book, you realize that they've done some pretty hurtful things to each other, and they're holding major secrets inside. This complexity was beautiful. Seeing them come to terms with themselves and what's happened, and then try to find their way back to each other was amazing. As for the romances, they do play an important role, and I thought they were generally well done, although I liked Noah's romance a bit more. The infatuation and the magic Noah feels with his love interest was beautifully written. I felt like Jandy Nelson did a great job of capturing what it feels like to be falling in love for the first time and realizing what's possible even while being so afraid of it, especially because Noah was firmly in the closet. Jude's romance, on the other hand, felt a little bit unrealistic. The theme of her romance was more fate. She and her love interest were fated to meet and fall in love, and while that's cute, the events that confirmed this fate theory were just too coincidental, too convenient for my taste. I also didn't appreciate that for the majority of the novel, Jude is pretending to be older than she is. Her love interest is in college, and as far as he's aware, so is Jude. That was just uncomfy, and I don't really like it when relationships are based on lies. My biggest issue with this book, though, is that it just felt like it didn't commit to being one thing. It's a contemporary book, but you also have touches of magical realism and paranormal aspects. Jude is very superstitious, and she spends the entirety of this book interacting with the spirits of her dead grandmother, and occasionally her mom as well. You never really get a confirmation for how real these spirits are and how much much of it is just Jude imagining it. It just felt like an odd thing to throw in there, and it was kind of jarring every time it came up. Still, the book was good. Nelson's writing can be very beautiful and whimsical. If you're a fan of metaphorical writing, then you'll probably fall in love with a lot of the lines in this book. Next up, I had quite the change of pace. I picked up Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, and I gave this book 4 stars. A little fun fact, I studied Russian language and culture throughout the majority of my time in college. Don't ask me why, it was a pretty random choice and I just decided to stick with it. But since then, I have had a particular interest in Russian literature, so I decided to pick this up since it's been on my shelf for quite a while. This book follows Raskolnikov, who in a moment of financial desperation and arrogance, commits murder. This happens pretty early in the book, and the rest of the story follows him as he skirts along the edges of the ensuing investigation and deals with his growing guilt. The topics and the plot of this book were right up my alley. I went through a major crime phase when I was younger, where I basically only wanted to consume books where people were murdered, take from that which you will. So not only was this a callback to that phase, but it also hit another thing that I love to see in books, which is a slow descent into madness. I don't know what it is, but I love to see the development of characters as they slowly become unhinged and their actions start to reveal the emotional turmoil that they're going through. I love it when they start to become unreliable and you can no longer trust their perceptions. This entire book was that. In the very first part of this book, Raskolnikov is working up to the murder, and hearing his justifications and his thoughts for it and how his plan later crumbles was fascinating. It was dark and it was violent, and it makes you question how flexible a person's morals can be given the right circumstances. The murder happens pretty early in the book, and after that, this book is more psychological than it is action-packed. Events happen, but for the most part, you're just a witness to Raskolnikov's thoughts as he continues to battle with himself, trying to justify his actions and kind of ignore the guilt that's creeping up on him. If you're not interested in books that are more character-driven versus action-driven, this might not be the book for you. I'm personally more of an action-driven sort of person too, but I find the psychology of a criminal to be fascinating. This is probably one of the first books I've read where you get to see a murderer have to come to terms with what he's done. This book doesn't have much to offer beyond that, in my opinion. The other characters are pretty one-dimensional, the relationships aren't developed, and they don't grow organically either. Realistically, if this book didn't cover topics that are particularly interesting to me, I wouldn't have rated it as high as I did. Next, I read The Zodiac Deception by Kriss. I'll be real with you. The plot of this book is a bit buck wild and over the top. Basically, this book follows a plot to assassinate Hitler. How, you may ask? Astrology. Our main character is a con man who's been roped into working with resistance members by posing as a German astrologer named Peter. It's up to Peter to use things like astrology to gain the trust of a high-ranking official who just happens to believe in things like horoscopes and palm readings. From there, he needs to convince this high-ranking official that Hitler's death is vital for Germany's prosperity. I gave this book 3 stars simply because I found it entertaining. I thought the premise was unique and I was interested to see how that would even work. I definitely enjoyed the scenes where Peter had to actively use his skills as a con man. I feel like I learned some cool new tricks from hearing his thought process and seeing how he puts together a deception. That being said, his character was too good. He just conveniently always had the knowledge and the training needed to get him and other people out of the situations that they're in. He just didn't have any flaws and pretty much never messed up. I didn't feel like he had a hard enough time gaining the trust of that high-ranking official or putting the plan into motion. Like, we're talking about a high-ranking Nazi, one of Hitler's most trusted men, and he just falls for Peter's con so easily. Granted, it takes a couple tries and Peter's walking on thin ice a lot of times. I feel like it should have been harder. Still, the book was entertaining and I enjoyed getting a peek into a resistance group. I feel like World War II books often don't show resistance or only show subtle or passive resistance. The people resisting in this book were active and they were doing anything they could to fight back. There's an underground radio station in this book that's been causing a lot of trouble for the Nazis, which I particularly enjoyed. Some people also actively committed crimes or violence, which I felt provided a more realistic spectrum. The next book actually turned out to be my favorite book in the entire month. I read The Last Story of Mina Lee by Nancy Jooyoun Kim, which I gave 4 stars. This is another dual perspective book that I listened to as an audiobook. The story starts with Margot traveling to her childhood home in Koreatown, LA because she's concerned about her mom, who hasn't been answering her calls for a couple weeks. When she gets there, however, she finds her mother dead in her apartment. The police rules the death an accident, but something doesn't feel right to Margot, so she starts investigating. In the process, she uncovers some secrets about her mother's life as an orphan of the Korean War and later as an undocumented immigrant. In between Margot's chapters, we get her mother Mina's perspective, starting 30 years prior when she first immigrated to the United States. I loved this book. I thought it was so beautifully written and heartfelt. I got more emotional than I thought I would, to be honest, because I felt like I related to Margot so much. Sometimes it's just so hard to remember that your parents had a whole life before you, and there's probably so much about them that you know nothing about. In Margot's case, the grief and pain she felt, not only because her mother was gone, but also also because the answer to so many questions were gone with her was heart-wrenching. Marco was mourning the loss of so much, and I felt her regret at just being too late to get to know her mom. When I tell you I called my mom every single day while reading this book, I'd be fucking lying, but I certainly thought about it because this book reminded me of so many complex emotions I've had in the past. I felt like the author perfectly captured what it can feel like to be the child of an immigrant and have this strained distance between you and your parents because you grew up in completely different worlds. I especially liked that there was a bit of a language barrier where neither Mina nor Margot were entirely fluent in the other's language, because that's such a common thing that I've seen both in my life and in the lives of other children of immigrants. You have this distance and you start to feel like no matter how much you want to fix it, there's this insurmountable barrier stopping you from fully expressing how you feel and connecting with each other. And that's what this whole book was about. It was about connection and realizing that people's individual lives are so far beyond what you may know. Mina's chapters were my absolute favorite. Honestly, at times it felt like I was just putting up with Margot's perspective and just waiting to get back to Mina. I didn't find the mystery aspect of figuring out how Mina actually died to be really compelling. I'll be honest with you, I didn't see the ending coming at all. All the clues were there, and I still didn't think that there was anything more to Mina's death. I was far more interested in her life. The emotions and the pain in this book was just phenomenally written. It was impossible to not think about my own mom and think about everything she went through to be the person that she is today. This was definitely an emotional read for me, and I really need to get my hands on a physical copy so that I can reread it. And unfortunately, it was followed by the worst book of the month for me. The next book I picked up was The Cusanus Game by Wolfgang Jeschke. I didn't even finish this one, and it takes a lot for me to DNF a book, so keep that in mind. I will give a disclaimer though, this is an uncorrected advanced reader copy, so maybe some of the issues that I had with it were fixed in the final edition, but I highly doubt it. The issues that I had with this book were pretty major. I don't think it could be fixed. Let me just read the synopsis for you, okay? Biologist Domenica Lengrina lives in a dying world. In the year 2052, a nuclear disaster in Germany irradiates all of Northern Europe. Global warming runs rampant, and economic and political calamities threaten the survival of Earth. While human DNA mutates and plant species are going extinct, scientists like Domenica work day and night to save their planet. It becomes increasingly apparent that the key to saving the future lies in the past. The Middle Ages and the character of Nicholas Cusa holds Domenica spellbound. She immerses herself in the strange workings of a culture foreign to her, though she risks changing the future with effects far more disastrous than radiation poisoning. I read about 300 pages before DNFing this book, and that synopsis has more action. At no point are you told about this nuclear disaster in Germany. All you know is that you're in this crumbling world, but you're not told any specifics about how it actually happened. You get that the planet is in upheaval and the quality of life is low, but there's no sense of urgency in this book at all. The pace was agonizingly slow. By the time I DNF'd this book, more than halfway through it, Domenica still hadn't time traveled, and I don't think she does until past the 400 page mark. Most of the lead up is just scientific conversation and Domenica pining after this guy who's on his own mission. And I don't even understand why she's so hung up on this guy, because their relationship felt so inauthentic. It happened really fast and I just didn't care. And then there's the switching perspectives. Most of the book is in Domenica's perspective, but occasionally you're reading from the perspective of the aforementioned Nicholas Cusa, who lives in the distant past. Domenica is supposedly obsessed with this man and his writings. Now you learn the reason why Domenica knows about him early on, but there's no real indication that she's obsessed with him. She doesn't really mention him. I have no idea why she's supposedly obsessed. None of that is explained. When you're reading Nicholas's perspective, you get hints of what Domenica's ultimate fate is, and the intrigue of that, along with the initial premise, is what kept me reading for so long, but I just couldn't go on. I read 300 pages of nothing. After that train wreck, I started transitioning into the spooky season with The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, which I gave 4 stars to. Another booktuber, Lexi, adores this book and talks about it all the time, so when I saw it on my library app, I decided to jump on it. This is a middle grade book that follows a boy named Nobody Owens, better known as Bod. When he was a baby, a man named Jack murdered his entire family, and Bod ended up in the graveyard where he was raised by ghosts and kept safe from Jack. I thought this was a very fun read. Middle grade tends to not really be my thing, but there are so many middle grade books that sound really interesting, so I've been trying to get more into them. I wouldn't say I'm head over heels for this book, but it definitely encourages me to keep reading middle grade books. This book had a really fun cast of characters. They did tend to be a bit one-dimensional, especially the villain, but I loved meeting the ghosts. I love the fact that when you're introduced to a new ghost, you don't just get their name, you get everything that's written on their gravestone. I thought that was a really cute touch. A lot of the first half of the book are just collections of events in Bod's life, so it really felt more character-driven, and as I've mentioned before, I prefer action-driven stories, but I came to appreciate those scenes in the second half of the book because everything Bod learned from them does start to come in handy when the plotline with Jack starts ramping up again. Once that plotline was reintroduced, I was way more invested. Neil Gaiman's writing is the perfect balance between spooky and whimsical. It was just a fun book to the very end. The narrator for this audiobook audiobook also had the perfect voice for it, so if you're a fan of audiobooks, I would definitely recommend it. For the last book of the month, I decided to keep with the spooky middle grade reads, and I picked up City of Ghosts by Victoria Schwab. I also gave this book 4 stars. This is the first book in the Cassidy Blake series, which follows a girl named Cassidy with the power to cross between the normal world and the ghost world. Cassidy's parents also happen to be ghost hunters, and they've recently gotten a TV deal which takes the entire family to Edinburgh, one of the most haunted cities in the world. While there, Cassidy finds out that there is another person with the same ability she has. She finds out that they actually have the ability to send ghosts to the other side permanently, and it may be up to Cassidy to do just that with a sinister ghost that's been haunting the city and hurting children. I think I enjoyed this book more than the Graveyard book. The concept of an in-between world isn't new, but I felt like Schwab's approach to it was a bit different. Cassidy and her new friend Lara gained their power because they did actually die for a moment, and I found it really interesting that when they cross over to the ghost world, they re-experience their deaths. I thought the ideas were really cool, and I felt like Schwab's writing was really descriptive and spooky, and I just loved it. I thought it was a very fun book. Like, Cassidy's best friend is a ghost. I loved him. And overall, the plot was interesting, and I actually felt a sense of urgency, which I felt I was lacking in some of the books this past month. I also really appreciate that everything was resolved in the end as well. I don't feel pressured to pick up the sequel, but Schwab left enough questions and intrigue that I want to pick it up anyway. Alright, that's it for today, y'all. I did actually read more books in the month of September, but that's being saved for future videos. If you want to try to guess what those videos are, you're welcome to check out my Goodreads, which is linked below, and check out which books I left out in this video. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, do all of the things. I'll see you in the next one.